what's up, Liron and Ruth here, and in today's video I'm going to show you how you can start painting realistic detailed watercolors today.
Okay, so first off, I printed two photos, two versions of it. The printer's running out of ink, but these are the two. I have one in color and another one in black and white. Now, the reason I printed it, the number one reason, is not only so that I can see the scene in front of me, not just in the computer, but also because it's easier to sample the color like that using this viewfinder. Now let me show you. If you compare it actually to the screen is so bright that the white could be lighter than the paper, and that's a huge problem because go figure how to match. Look at the printed picture. The paper white is pretty much the same, right? It's a bit yellowish, but that's fine. On the screen it's actually lighter, so it's almost impossible to match the color, which is why I always recommend, especially for these kinds of more complex scenes, to work with a printed photo. Now, this brings me to one of the first most important kind of pointers about painting realistically, which is what we're going to discuss today, of course. And that is, it's not so much about skill as it is about being very careful, very patient, and very deliberate. That's the main thing here. If you can really take your time with mixing, with painting, with everything, you too can achieve a realistic result. Now, let me reiterate and kind of explain. So, one of the big ideas here is to work in small, manageable shapes, as small as you can. And what I like to do in these kinds of scenes is, first off, a drawing that is very detailed and accurate, and you can have access to this drawing. I'll put a link, of course, in the description box below. But the drawing itself is crucial for that because you really need to build things up so that when you paint, all you have to do is think about painting. Now, small manageable shapes. So now I'm working on the first kind of shape that I knew how to work. I will add one more thing to that. These kinds of processes will include a bit more glazing in them, and that is to be a bit more careful. Yes, I can create this very same painting working top to bottom and just kind of connecting everything together. But if you truly want to mix things accurately, it's much easier to just work section by section. The only exception is if some shapes are so close to one another and kind of overlap or touch each other, I may use the opportunity to continue a wash like I'm doing here. Started with the body of the boat, then I got to the lower part, and I'm still technically in the same wash, and it's going to be the same for the shadow under the boat, but it's still a small consolidated shape. Now, I do want to give you one note regarding value. There is, again, more glazing involved here to be more accurate, so I'd rather err on the side of caution and go too light and then have to go over with another wash. That way I make sure I don't go too dark. So what you're seeing right now, especially for the body of the boat, I'm going to go over it yet again and darken it. Now, there is one more aspect that goes into this specifically for this process. Have you noticed that the paper is a little different from what I usually use? That is correct. This is hot press paper. I'm more of a cold press guy, but I really want to start improving my skills with hot press paper. And look at how much of an uneven wash I'm getting here, simply because hot press paper behaves a little differently and it takes some time getting used to. There are some advantages that already I can point my finger towards and say this is really big, and that is there's no texture, so you are less constrained with the tip of the brush due to the paper's tooth, right? It just does not affect it as much, and that's a really important point, something to make note of. One more thing is just the smoothness of it. You can't see the texture afterwards, and that could be a huge advantage depending on the style you aim for. And I think, technically speaking, if you're painting small, it should be not easier, but the end result potentially can look a little more realistic due to the smoothness of paper and a lack of texture. There isn't anything covering it up, which is why I really want to master this kind of paper. But of course, I'm getting started at square one like everyone else, which is why look at how wet these washes are. Otherwise, I know I won't get an even wash. Same concept with the water here. Okay, I mixed a very strong blue compared to the body of the boat and especially the reflection of the boat. I'm going very light here because I'd rather have good flow and mark for myself where the water goes and what highlights I should skip. And then I can always do another wash on top of that to darken. And for that following wash, I'll already know exactly where to paint because I marked the way using this wash. You see how that works? This is why I'll sometimes err on the side of caution of going too light, both for technique and flow, but also for looks, and getting accuracy and not going too dark, but also for technique and flow. Okay, I'm going through the same process for this boat. We will see some of that too, but then afterwards I'm going to skip ahead a bit. You'll see and skip one boat. So this process isn't going to contain everything because it was super long. Let me know in a comment below if you really want to see everything, and then I can make a kind of separate I guess upload of just everything. Just let me know because it's gonna be like an hour and a half maybe. But so yeah, just I want to know before that. This is definitely enough to follow along with me. You can follow along with me using this video, but if anyone wants to see the full thing, just I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So continuing the wash from top to bottom, one very subtle thing that I noticed here in the reference photo is how the reflections in the water are a little more muted. So you'll see a common theme where the body of the boat is a gray, but a bluish gray. And then as you move down and you get to the reflection of the body of the boat, it's just a cleaner gray. And all of these subtle color matching and subtle, careful value matching, that's what makes it realistic. And the more you can nail those, the more likely you are to create a realistic impression. And the reality is, if you're working in my most typical impressionistic style, you will get something beautiful, but it's very hard to get all the details, all the accuracy and everything like this without greatly simplifying some things. So if you aim for not only realistic watercolor, but also detailed watercolor, sometimes multiple glazes is the way to go. Okay, now we will talk in just a few moments about patterns of reflections, but for now, just look at what I did. I left a few highlights in the water, and then I'm starting to put some darks in them like I just did earlier, but the water is still, again, too light. Don't forget, we're going to go over it again. Now, this color, I took a lot of care in matching. I wanted to make sure it's a brown, but it's a very beautiful, saturated kind of yellowy brown. And it's one of those colors that actually shine quite a bit in this scene, which is why it was very important for me to get it right. You will see this alongside a yellow that's going to join the scene later are some of the most, I guess, strongest contrasts with the blues, which is why it was very important for me to include them. Now, one could argue that I could, because I need to darken the body of the boat again, one could argue that I could continue from this point and extend it down to the body of the boat and make it darker. But my approach here was a little slower and more deliberate here. Had I been using cold press paper, I probably would have gone for it. And remember, this isn't an either or. It's not like you either work super impressionistically like I'm used to doing, or you work like this in small, tiny shapes. You can do some kind of an amalgam of both, a hybrid approach. I'm a big fan of hybrid approaches. Whenever you recognize an opportunity to connect two shapes together, that is more than welcome, right? But overall, you need to be aware of, will I be able to mix the right value and the right color if I'm just connecting the shapes, okay? Now, let me hop on from this thought to, again, one of the main ideas of realistic and detailed painting. There is nothing special about me or this process. This does not come down to skill. It almost does not even come down to timing or being aware of wet and wet. Yes, I am utilizing a bit of that here, but for the most part, it's all about putting the right value and right color in the right place. And as opposed to our main approach, this time we're focusing on much smaller areas, one at a time. Now, what's the direct implication of this? You don't need the technique. There isn't anything that I know and you don't for the most part that you can't do. So what's the byproduct of that? You can go ahead and today paint this very same scene. And it will be dependent on, are you patient enough to mix the right color and mix the right value? And are you willing to check yourself and test again and again and start very light and err on the side of caution of not going too dark, but also not being scared to glaze if you went too light, right? This is not about technique. It's not about something special about me or even experience. You can do this. This is the point of this video, and I would like you, if you're interested in that kind of a style, to go for it. You know me well. I'm not always, and by the way, here's that yellow I talked about. I'm not always into this style. What I like personally is the more loose, impressionistic paintings, and the more realistic I can get them based on my skill and experience, the better. But that's not necessarily the goal in and of itself. It's more like, how much can I simplify this and push the impression while maintaining the essence of the subject? However, once in a while, I'll have this need, this urge to paint something more detailed and more realistic. And you know what? The way I like it, and look at, I'm making use of, again, shapes one next to one another. So I'm going yellow, and that dark black brown is touching the yellow. So I am making some use of wet next to wet. It's not all small contained shapes, but that's more of my choice, okay? And as a side tangent, I want you to look at the background, and in just a few minutes, you'll see how it slowly comes together and it looks great, just because we did it step by step and we took our time. But in any case, once in a while, I'll crave doing a more detailed painting, and then I know that I need to allow this to myself to kind of scratch that itch and go back to my looser impressionistic works. Now, one of my favorite ways of tackling these highly realistic and detailed scenes is to paint small, because what I would much rather is to paint a small painting where technique is a little easier, because smaller washes, easier to control, easier to maintain, to work that way. And here's that water glaze, making it darker. Again, I told you it was too light, and now I have a roadmap. I know exactly where to paint, right? And you'll see how the white will pop much, much better and look much, much better. But in any case, I prefer smaller because it's easier, more manageable. You waste, quote unquote, less paper, right? And one final note in that regard is it just looks really impressive from afar, right? Because it's small and detailed. But one last point about what I wanted to say about hot press versus cold press is the smaller you paint, the more the tooth of the paper is more significant. And think about it, that makes sense, because the details are smaller and then the tooth can really get in the way, which is one of the other reasons I wanted to try hot press, because in theory with hot press you can paint as small as you'd like, as long as you have a small enough of a brush, right? So that's the direction from where I'm coming to this process. Now, look at something interesting that's happening here, and I will talk a bit about colors in just one second, like the specific colors I'm using. But once I added this blue darker wash, the reflection of the boat suddenly, and here's some wet in wet for you, the reflection of that boat became too light. So don't worry, we're gonna go over it and darken it. It takes time for things to fall into context. So have that in mind. It's not going to immediately look right or immediately look realistic. It can take a few moments for it to really find its voice, so to speak, and really look right. Okay, so one more thing to not worry about. You focus on the small shapes and examine them one by one and figure out, okay, how does this shape look? Is it this value, that value? Turn the photo black and white. That can really help. In fact, you can do a black and white study, and that will be even easier, right? Make everything easier on yourself, but you can still paint a highly realistic scene in black and white, in small format, and get a beautiful, beautiful result, even working that way. So now I want to give you a quick note. I'm mixing here, again, a bit more blue, and I'm using test paper. One thing you'll find in these processes is you're going to go through a bunch of test papers as we put more emphasis on really matching the colors. Okay, so just one fun kind of fact to have in mind. Have a lot of test papers ready, because you have to test it out somewhere and make sure that you got the right values, correct? And the right colors especially. So yeah. Now colors, you know, I don't usually praise colors. They have their place, but if you really want to go for something that's truly, you know, accurate and loyal to the source, then yes, colors become more important. Now, all of these ropes that I painted negatively around so far, you could use masking tape, you could use masking fluid, you could use whatever you want to get them right. Don't let my process dictate how you should do it. I just wanted to kind of work on it from start to finish without anything else. You know, I'm not a big fan of taping masking tape or masking fluid, but if you know how to work with it and you have fun working with it, you do that. Now, a word about the colors. I'm mostly using French ultramarine and phthalo blue. Now, for the water, I actually added a bit of Jaune Brilliant color, semi kind of opaque yellowish white, kind of like buff titanium, into the blue. I find that it gives it a look that I liked, but that's more of a personal taste, right? And then I'm using, again, of course, French ultramarine for the more subtle blues, but also for the more like navy looking blues, if that makes sense. And then I'm using Indian yellow. That's the only yellow I'm using in this scene. And I'm also using quinacridone rose and a touch of pyrrole scarlet, if I'm not mistaken, that you're going to see later on. Now, one more note about this kind of process, and look at me go again, glazing on top of that part that was too light. Again, always reassess. Is it too dark? Is it too light? You shouldn't go too dark because you're going to work a very careful and deliberate approach. So I don't expect you to go too dark. Again, err on the side of caution. But just something to have in mind, right? Now, look at, again, how much this reflection, it asks to be darkened. So much. And remember, the reflections are more muted. So I'm starting to mix a more muted gray. One more note I wanted to say regarding the process itself, okay? These kind of paintings, I find, lend themselves really well to a slow and patient process, as I mentioned before. Now, what this means is you can feel free to finish this in multiple sittings. In fact, what I would say is take as long as you need. Think about it almost like a long-term project, kind of like you would with an oil painting that you have to give enough time to dry, and there's a lot of nuances that go into that. You can almost treat this the same way. Don't force yourself to finish this, definitely not in one sitting, but also not in one day or 1 week. You can just do a shape, feel good about it, or do a few shapes, feel good about them, and then move on to the next one, right? And because I'm focusing on small shapes, I can actually do all these nuances that you're seeing right now and really trying to paint it as I see it. Not an easy thing with all of these details in the ripples, okay? Now, this brings me to another important point, and that is the details on the ripples. There are some patterns here. You have to remember one thing. So I'm a big fan of painting things as they appear. You don't necessarily have to understand them. In fact, it's sometimes better if you don't understand them, but you just paint them as you see them, as cleanly as you can. You treat them as abstract shapes, especially ripples. But one thing to be aware of is those ripples and reflections in the ripples, they reflect reality. So they reflect something above, which is why there are patterns to them. What do I mean by that? If you look at the yellow section of ripples, this section is, you see, it follows a kind of vertical line from top to bottom. You don't get much yellow on the left side because there is some kind of a yellow object above that we're not seeing from our angle, okay? Same goes for the darks within those yellow ripples, right? You can see they follow a pattern where the darkest is on the right and the lightest is on the left. Look at what I'm doing now. I'm adding red. You can see some red in the reference photo and then some blue to its left. But look at the red. It goes vertically from top to bottom and then the blue goes to its left. So it's very tempting to just kind of go haphazardly and paint those ripples. And that's fine, that's great, and enjoy yourself, right? And especially if you work a more impressionistic style like my usual work, which could be fun to try and paint this in that style, you can totally go for it. But just have in mind that just understanding that this reflects reality, it is important if you can to get the nuance. And the ripples actually take up the water, even takes up half this painting. If you notice, the boats are around the middle of the paper, which means the water here is quite a big focal point and you want to make sure you capture it, okay? Now, remember what I said earlier about the background? You're gonna see in just a few moments how beautifully it's going to connect. And I know right now it looks like a big mess, but the more details I add to it, the more it will start looking like something, the more some of its shapes are going to be justified, some of the shadows and the light. And our brain doesn't need to know exactly what it's looking at, but if it at first glance can tell, oh, that makes sense to me, then you're good. So you can tell there's kind of a boat there or a few boats in the background. That's all our brain really needs for that. Sorry, I had a cough. Maybe there will be another one, I don't know. But notice where we are in the process right now. I'm starting to add some darks. So here I'm adding these browns, same pattern, see, above, one above another, because they reflect this thing that goes there, right? And now I'm starting to add again some darks to it. So I'm starting to put the shadow on these ropes and riggings and whatnot. I'm starting to darken also the reflections if necessary. And in just a few moments, you'll start seeing me putting in the slightly darker ripples of the reflections of the rope, okay? Now, there is a lot of the pattern of light next to dark here. The ropes, they're very light, but they also have a shadowy side, and the reflections in the water work the same way. But the reflections in the water are a distorted view. That's something to have in mind, okay? That distortion. Kind of like trees, kind of like everything in nature, the pattern of ripples is a bit random. Try to paint it a bit random. Don't fall into the mistake of doing the same wavy pattern, because that's something that can happen, okay? So just like trees, you have to train your brain to kind of go very abstractly about it. And it's a fun thing to do anyway. And I'm going to show you in just a moment how I analyze the scene and fix some more mistakes. But look at how adding these light blues next to the dark blues to indicate the well-lit side of the boat really makes more sense of the blue in the shadow. Because when you look at it in the shadow, it's very hard to tell what color it is. It's a very dark blue, right? But once you put it in the lit side of the boat, it just brings so much out of it. And now I'm killing some of the highlights in the water. I felt like they competed with the boats too much. And while I have this very same color, I'm starting to put those darker details I was talking to you about. So this stage of the painting honestly just takes more patience, okay? We're putting in this, you know, that fence or something around a yacht, boat, whatever it is. And you just have to be careful. Now, some people like to rotate the paper to get these lines accurately. I don't have that luxury because I do want to avoid disorienting you. So I'm keeping the paper at the same angle. I know I could move it around, but I prefer not to, honestly. It makes my editing for the video easier too. So I kind of rotate my hand and work with it, right? Now, in just a moment, you'll see me using a very nice blue. And look at the background. Look at how it takes shape. Now, the highlight is justified. There's something that's beveled out. But in any case, in just a moment, you'll see me using some beautiful riggings and ropes in blue. Strong, strong blue that I mixed using phthalo blue and some of the Joan Brilliant, the same color, just to make it a little more opaque. But look at the background. It really takes shape and it starts to make sense. I love these stages. Added some darkness where the boat meets the water and kind of using my finger to blend it, move it around. Here are the blue riggings. This is so beautiful, and you'll see it in the final scan. It looks really, really nice once I share that with you. Around the end, here's another one. Just small details, very small touches here and there. And the next stage would be to add a bit of opaque paint. Once we're done with the dark details, and in this way, this process is similar to my more impressionistic work, starting with the shadows and the details, and then I move on to some highlights that I missed or some corrections. And by the way, we could add all the ropes using highlights and paint over them, which maybe I should have done, and maybe I'll do another attempt at it. And that way I don't have to do so much negative painting, and the ropes may look a little smoother and more accurate. Now here I'm adding a bit of darker ripples of blue, so I pre-wet some area in the water, and then bam, I'm going wet and wet because I wanted to get smooth edges. Sometimes it's much easier to pre-wet a small area and do some wet and wet in it, as opposed to putting a mark and trying to blend its edges. Okay, so that's something I talk about. If you just check out the channel, I have a bunch of videos about wet and wet technique that you may want to check out, and that can really help. I just write down to myself that I said that around the 24 mark because I want to put the links so that it's easier to access. And here we go with those, the opaque paint. Beautiful. This is actually designer's gouache, so it's gouache, it's not watercolor. John got me some, and I'm super grateful for that. Thank you so much, John. And I wanted to try it out, and I love it. I really like it. It's more neutral than my Joan Brilliant. It's just a white, kind of like Chinese white. It looks really good, and it's almost like a super powerful tool for bringing out those small highlights, details, gaps, even gaps in shapes that you missed. That's a really good way of adding those. And yeah, that's pretty much the process. Again, patience, working shape by shape, small manageable shapes, being more deliberate, more, more careful and patient. Here I am signing this, but look at what happens here. So I'm signing this, but we're still not done with the process. I still have a few more corrections, you know me. So I tried making this rope a little smaller to kind of minimize it. Now I'm blending this edge that stayed a little too hard for my taste. So see, I'm blending it with a bit of water and a brush, scrubbing the edge. A hot press paper allows you more of that without lifting the paint, which is actually quite fun. So that's another advantage to that. And now we're going to remove the tape, but immediately after that, I'm going to share with you a comparison in black and white of the painting and the reference photo. And you're going to see the mistakes. Some areas are too light, some areas are too dark. And so we'll make a few quick corrections after that. Remember, you can always take the painting and add corrections. So let me show you that these spots right here, they're going to be marked. You can see it's a little too dark or too light, so I'm going ahead and darkening this. This didn't work out the way I wanted. I added opaque white paint to try and lighten some spots. It didn't work, so instead we're going to darken some spots, okay? Same goes for this boat in the background. I just felt like a stronger contrast with it will make the boat in the middle pop, okay, a little more. Same goes for those reflections, and then we're going to do the same to the reflections of the boat that's closest to us, but not to the boat itself. Reason being, I don't want it to pop too much because it's close. But this, look at how much this dark really increases the value scale. This is one of the most important parts, actually, of the improvements that I did here. Just anchors it to the scene, makes it look so much better. But in any case, here is our final result, and I'm going to also zoom in and show it to you better from more up close. Just a beautiful painting. I've really enjoyed doing this one for you. And remember, if there's anything you take from this video, you can do this too. This is just about the patience. It's not even about technique, okay? So if you want to learn how to paint realistically like me, be sure to check out my watercolor realism course. If you still haven't, I'm going to put a link in the description box below. I think you're going to really like it. It's going to show you how to paint realistically by looking at the different factors. It's very scientific. You're looking at the shapes, at the values, at the edges, and you should be able to, by the end of this course, paint pretty much anything you want realistically. So thank you so much, and now we will wrap this one up. Take care.